Good morning, friends and colleagues from all over the world. Welcome to our Leading Edge lecture series today, where we featured Professor David Theo Goldberg from University of California, Irvine. First of all, I'd like to thank the Department of Foreign Languages and Literature for co-organizing this activity with us. And secondly, of course, we'd like to thank Professor Goldberg for agreeing to give this talk for us. Before I proceed to introduce Professor Goldberg, let me just say give a very brief introduction to the institute where we are producing this activity. The Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University, at the National Taiwan University, is a platform for cross-disciplinary exchanges, where we hope to bring together, people from different backgrounds to interact and hopefully produce new possibilities of research and insights into the future of humanities. And so among the different kinds of activities that we organize, the Leading Edge lecture series is one that feature the most established scholars from all over the world to share with us their most recent research. And so I'm sure, Professor Goldberg's talk will substantiate what I just said. Okay, good morning, Professor Goldberg. Let me first make a very brief introduction of him. Professor David Theo Goldberg is currently a distinguished professor at University of California, Irvine. He is most well known for his works on race studies, but in fact, he has a very wide-ranging expertise, which ranges from economics, politics, philosophy, and legal studies. And so he's a very versatile and let's say, expertised person, not only in terms of academic work, but also in terms of social impact. When he was a PhD student, he already founded a company called Meta Films, where they produce, among other things, all kinds of film and music videos, of which some have actually aired on MTV. And it also produced an award-winning film on Robben Island called The Is/Land, or The Island, which won an important award. And among his numerous works, academic works, there's so many books, let me just mention a few. For instance, Racist Culture, Philosophy and the Politics of Meaning, Racial Subjects, Writing on Race in America, The Threat of Race, The Future of Learning Institutes in a Digital Age, The Future of Thinking, Learning Institutions in a Digital Age. And most recently, Are We All Post-Racial Yet, which was published in 2015, and Dread, The Futures, which is his most recent work. And today, he's going to talk with share with us his his most recent thinking on the subject of dread, which is a takeoff from his book, but will be extended into more uncharted areas. Okay, David, sorry about this long introduction, and please.
Thank you very much, Professor Liao, Sebastian Hsien-hao. It's really a pleasure to be here. I really enormously appreciate the invitation. Sorry I can't be with you in person. Taipei is such a nice place to hang out in. And for that generous introduction. I was going to try to share a screen, but apparently technology is not on our side tonight, so I'm just going to have to read and talk and talk and read. The title of the talk is States of Dread, and it is talking about and around the book I've recently published called Dread Facing Futureless Futures, which came out this past summer. So by states of dread, I have contrasting conceptions in mind. First, a state as a condition inhabited. So when we say we're in a certain state, we're inhabiting a condition of being. And second, a or the state as the set of institutional apparatuses governing a collective taking itself or being taken as a people, that more normal sense of state institutional apparatuses. So I'm going to start and focus on the first sense, but come to the second sense sort of later in the talk. So why dread now? In about 2016, 2017, obviously in the United States, leading up to the craziness of the Trump election in 2016, but really a host of conditions sort of surrounding that event, the rise of autocratic rule in a variety of places, and so on. It left one by the end of 2016 and into 2017 with a sort of driving sense of there's something wrong in the world. Anxiety seemed to be increasing. Environmental considerations, which I'll come to a bit later, were clearly becoming more palpable and evident. Floods and high seas and huge storms and fires and so on and so forth. And these struck me, particularly the authoritarian and autocratic politics, struck me as something of a symptom. Right, in a way it was adding to the feeling of unease and dis-ease that was emergent, but it seemed to me that there were other things at work. And by the beginning of 2017, I and my colleagues around me were waking up every day feeling this sense of deep and abiding unease, and I was trying to put my finger on it. And one morning I woke up, I go swimming every morning in a serious kind of way, and in the swimming pool, it struck me, it's a feeling of dread. So I started looking around, thinking about dread, looking for what else had been written philosophically or theoretically about dread, and there wasn't a whole lot. I mean, there's obviously Kierkegaard, who was writing about dread before he was writing about fear. I mean, the famous essay on fear was preceded by an equally substantive essay on dread, what he actually called dread himself. There was clearly Freud, particularly his later works, writing on anxiety. I mean, his theory of anxiety developed over his lifetime, and by the later contributions, anxiety had taken a particular form, and not a whole lot else. I mean, there were bits and pieces of things. You could add Sartre on nausea and so on and so forth. But when you compare it to other kinds of abiding, not least effective conceptions, there was very little contemporary work. So what then dread? How to think about dread? and I want to put together sort of two ways of thinking about it. One represented by my very good friend and colleague and co-overnight here in the US, Akbar Abbas, who speaks of dread as an affect representing an emotion which is unmoored from the originating conditions giving rise to it, on the one hand, or not yet recognized or recognizable. So you have this sort of abiding, unsettling sense, not yet recognized or recognizable in the terms currently available to us. So in each case, right, unmoored from the originating conditions on the one hand, unnameable, right, in the standard terminology we've come to sort of think of our world on the other. In each case, there's a degree of indecipherability. There's a disconnect between feeling and the naming, the ability to articulate the feeling. So that's on the one side, that sense of indecipherability. And on the other, when you think of Lauren Berlant, the late Lauren Berlant's famous work, Cruel Optimism, what she does is raise the relation, particularly in the context of the US, but you can generalize it to other places, raise the relation between affective sensibility, in this case, the feeling of anxiety, the sense of dread, on the one hand, and the crush of the material conditions of life. So the relation between the feeling, the sensibility, the affect, and the conditions of life giving rise to the feeling, right? The material conditions underpinning it. But more generally, this opened up a way of thinking about those material conditions of affect, in this case of dread, that I was trying to grapple with. So putting together that condition of indecipherability with the material conditions giving rise to the possibility that I and others around me were feeling in this way. And, you know, one of the, a common response to the way of posing it in these terms, people often say to me, well, you seem to be saying that we're doomed. I mean, the very subtitle of my book, Facing Futureless Futures, suggests there's no future at hand. And that's not quite what I'm saying. A future that's futureless is still a future, right? I mean, it takes on a particular kind of form. Eugene Thacker, for example, has a book called Doom, and where he claims that we are doomed in part because, right, the conditions surrounding us today have become unavailable to philosophical thinking because philosophical thinking has kind of removed itself as a possibility of helping to understand our world. I think he's wrong about that. Philosophical thinking takes new forms, and I think he's just not recognizing some of the forms it's taking, right? So, but it points to the sense of pervasive pessimism, that sense of we're doomed, which is a term he actually uses in some quarters today, in the face of, you might call it the apocalyptic. You think, for instance, of Lars von Trier's Melancholia, right? Where there's a sense of watching the end of the universe, the end of the world that we inhabit, and going into a melancholic state as a consequence. I mean, Afro-pessimism in relation to conditions in America assumes a sort of sensibility of that kind. But as James Baldwin insisted, pessimism is an academic exercise, right? In the real world, Baldwin says, there's no room for pessimism. One has to actually roll up one's sleeves and try and sort of dig oneself out of this set of conditions. To be alive, he adds, requires actually a resistance to this pessimism, to giving in to the given as unchangeable. And so I want to sort of grapple with this. Dread then has struck me as requiring a more sustained analysis of the relation of indecipherability, that being unable to actually give a concrete account, to its underlying material conditions for an affect like this to take hold socially. What is it that we're living through at the moment to produce this? And whether the affect is constraining, you could call it a downer, right? Or mobilizing, if not an upper, at least a get off your behind and do something, do anything but do something, to quote Günter Grass, right? So how then to think about dread against this background? First, as I say, there's this notion of indiscernibility, of being not able to decipher quite what's going on, in contrast with the more concrete notion of fear. Fear, when one suffers or goes through a condition of fear, one is able more or less to point out its object, right? You can say what it is that's producing that fear, that concern. In that sense, it's like mourning. When you mourn the loss of somebody, you know who it is that you're mourning. I mean, there's a palpable person that has disappeared from your life, and one grieves the disappearance, that they'll no longer be there to be able to talk to or argue with or have a big fight with or whatever. And it's that loss of that particular person or that particular set of people that you're mourning. And I want to say fear is like that. Dread is like melancholia. Melancholia is not being able quite to identify the object that is giving rise to this palpable sense. I mean, in the case of Van Trier's film, you know, what is it that is producing melancholia? The fact that the end of the world is coming, the fact that one can't do anything about it, the fact that one is stricken in such a way that you can't get off your behind because there's no getting off your behind as the comet or whatever it is, the planetary body, comes closer and closer and closer to one, right? What I want to say about dread is it can't quite pin down its object. It doesn't quite know what it is that's, you know, the anxiety is palpable, but what is it? And I want to suggest that it's not one thing, right? It's a range of considerations that in an impalpable sense sort of come together, and out of that arises this deepening anxiety. There's something happening here and you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? I mean, the Ballad of a Thin Man from Bob Dylan, right? Sort of penned in a different context, but there's something to that. So there's a kind of ill-at-easeness, an unsettledness in the face of what Kierkegaard characterizes as the desanctification and disenchantment, or at the very least in how the taken for granted world has become unsettled, or less recognized or unrecognizable in the terms at our disposal, to go back to Akbar's point. And anxiety then more or less abiding or increasingly so in the face of this uncanniness, the unheimlich condition of things being faced, in the Freudian sense. Things sensed but still obscure. You know there's something there, but you don't quite know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? That something is socially amiss. What I call an unmatchable tear in the social fabric, through or out of which all sorts of poisonous social leakages are oozing or seeping out, and one can't quite put one's finger on it, either to name or identify what is giving rise to it. A nauseating smell or sound one cannot name, because something one has not known or quite experienced before. So dread registers a sense of this abiding insecurity in the face of all of this, of the altogether unpredictable and indecipherable. So as Kierkegaard indicates, dread is a sensibility taking hold in the absence of any larger or higher power, a kind of reliable power, or one thinks it's a reliable power, one at least bigger than ourselves, to turn to either for an account of what is being faced, or either oneself or collectively, or to blame for the condition in which we find ourselves. I mean, Kierkegaard was grappling with the disappearance of God, right? And when there's no possibility of God to turn to in his account, there's no possibility of redemption. So one has only oneself to fall back on in order to give an account of all the things that one's facing, and sometimes that's insufficient. Dread, in effect, registers that there's no possibility of salvation, right? There's no possibility of looking to an elsewhere and otherwise. Elon Musk wants to go to Mars to save himself from, all the horrors of the world that he's helped to create. But, you're just going to recreate those things over there. So what's the point, right? In a certain sense, in the face of the mess we've gotten ourselves into. So dread sounds a siren of sorts. You can call it the canary, our own canary in the mine of the social. So what then prompts dread today? What is it that's giving rise to dread now? I mean, dread, it's not that dread hasn't been there before. I mean, Kierkegaard was, well over a century ago. But the conditions today are sort of coming down to something else, right? And I want to say there are a range of conditions that work together. I want to concentrate mostly on one this evening, or your morning, and mention a couple of others that are exacerbating this sort of driving condition, this change in our culture, which is produced by the algorithmic. That's the one I want to focus on now. The algorithmic factors heavily into contemporary systemic burial or erasures of the terms for recognizing the buried or the buried alive of ordered structures, systems, institutions, practices of injustice, so of racism or gender discrimination, or class, deepening class inequality in our society. Algorithmic culture has shaped our ways of being in the world. It's predicated on, produces and references a range of conditions that we have come to define us. A leaning on inductive reasoning tended to correlations rather than causations, right? An activating logic of hypothetical imperatives, of the condition of if-then. The allure of disrupting, right? So disruption has become a characteristic of our social life. The production of constantly of the new, and exacerbating hyper-individualization and personal responsibility that we're supposed to take for everything that happens to us, right? And a temporality of instantaneity, of the instance, of the moment after moment after moment that our culture has tended to produce for us, a kind of presentism, that history is made a database of facts rather than an actual past. I mean, history now is just what's compiled in the memory of the computer, right? And it gets activated when we need it and then put to sleep again when we don't. Right? So algorithmic temporality, by extension, dematerializes as it embodies a kind of temporality, what Michael Hanchett calls, in a paper called Afro-Modernity, what he calls racial time. What the inequalities of temporality that result from power relations between dominant and subordinate groups, racially dominant and subordinate groups. The mediation of algorithmic time, its reach for immediation, constituting its mediation, at best flattens the historical, as I say. There is then also a sense of time at work, the time of a kind of inscribed life in terms of the horizon of life's possibilities, a lifespan, a normative and imagined time, a time to maturation and adulthood, an inherited time, a time in terms of the day-to-day living out of time, and a time in terms of the time of being in the world or of other modernities, right? And in a way, algorithmic time eclipses all of that and replaces it with this time of instantaneity. What is it to imagine temporalities outside of these constraining frames, to break with racially constraining time, to reach for an aspirational sociality, for a new social ontology shorn of these sinews and threads, constraints and suspensions. And this requires incessant work, even after any revolutionary renting from or break with the given. You think of Fanon as the production, particularly in his earlier work, the production of the new man, right? But in the wake of the clearing away of the constraints of the past, requires a work to construct something in its place. And Fanon's later work speaks to that in terms of this psychoanalytic capacity to deal with violence. The time of emancipation and emancipatory time is to reach toward a futurity while drawing on yet breaking with the experience of the past, at odds with the immediacy in our time of algorithmic temporality. So algorithmic culture is designed to inform and reinforce the choices one makes, the recognized desires, likes, preferences, the schemes expressed that come to us daily on our screen, right? This algorithmic culture pumps up the volume of the choices it's actually encouraged one to make, generalizing divisions those choices reflect, enact, and reproduce. So it reinforces the creation of groups bounded within themselves. Where the preferences are political, as algorithmic culture drives them increasingly to do, these commitments become code for committing oneself to the life and lifestyle they represent, that way of being in the world, and so to those projecting to you that they are working to maintain that way of being, to advance or better it. Consumptive preference schemes become political cultural iron cages, socio-solipsistic echo chambers. I'm talking to no one but reflections of myself in the social mirror. So there's this feeding loop where I click on something and then I get exactly the same thing fed back to me, which then reinforces the desire for more of the same and for more like me who are requesting exactly the same thing. So it reinforces that set of bounded socialities. There's a kind of algorithmic fueling of hyper self-satisfaction, cycles of satisfaction, dissatisfaction, disruption and renovation, exactly the impulse towards incessant conflict, a kind of self-securitization, both of what one takes to be one's own and more pressingly of one's way of being in the world. And so we'll see that the outcome of all of this is a kind of civil war conceived in a particular kind of way, almost an inevitable outcome of this logic, namely the war, the conflict between, not in the conventional sense of civil war, but between contrasting or contesting modes of being in the world. I want this way to live, you want that way to live, and we start kind of banging at each other. Civil war is no longer the end of politics, but as Foucault says, it's normalized expression or condition. And one sees it, if any of you have been following the case of critical race theory in the United States, that's exactly what's going on over here. Those who are committed to critical race theory as an analytic, and those who think critical race theory is going to destroy the country, and there's a banging of heads together. Dread then is the affect most readily associated with this warring disposition, precisely because dread, in contrast to fear, is never clear about its exact object of concern. Dread is a driving sense of anxiety lurking in losing control of large swaths of one's life, in these spaces of indiscernibility, that something is deeply amiss while never quite knowing the source, or its source, or being able to put one's finger especially on it. So it's the ghost, you could say, haunting the operating system that produces it. One can see all this playing out in the ways cultures of whiteness become embedded as a default into algorithmic codes, or codes of a particular stereotypical kind if you're not living in a country where black and white are the driving sort of dominant features. But in the US in particular, driving much of the cultural reproduction of these things, what's embedded in the algorithm are the stereotypes representative of a certain kind of whiteness. White becomes the default color of coding, its cultures, its assumptions, its dominant preferences, its frames through which the world is viewed. The unseen or taken for granted backgrounds of all formative experience, coded bias and digital discrimination become the given, the social structure of the time of the algorithm. Algorithmic neutrality in the abstract becomes racial reproduction in fact. its operations now more or less invisible, even as the effects are visibly ramped up as though coming out of nowhere, as though they're just a natural part of the structure, the fabric of the life we live, the natural state of the world. The algorithmic, you could say, is the perfect discriminating machine, precisely because it hides, right, where the discriminations are coming from, and it makes it seem like it's just a given of life, of nature, of the way the world inevitably is. In a sense, algorithms give us commands, right? The if-then. If you want to do X, then if you want Y to happen, then do X. If you do X, then Y will follow. And so just coding life into that form of thinking becomes a way of naturally reproducing what are actually socially produced. You know, this, in that sense, the way in which discrimination, in the way I've mentioned, is coded into the very algorithmic being of things, frees itself of a kind of responsibility, right? Algorithms are kind of operationalized robotically, as are via robots. The great replacement at work, for example. So Amazon in its warehouses are replacing human workers with robotic workers that are dressed up to look like, you know, they're white on the outside, and of course with machinery on the inside, and they're doing all the packing at 4 times the rate that human beings are able to pack. And human beings in the production line then have to speed up their delivery of things, so in order to keep up with the temporality of the robotic. So there's a kind of replacement, both in the sense that robots are replacing humans producing anxiety in the condition of work, but also the sort of sense that, you know, very different people of very different cultural backgrounds conventionally would work in these warehouses, and they're being replaced by robots who are made to look white or white-like. So the undertaking to anthropomorphize the robotic, all those robots made to look sort of human, is the attempt to hide the monstrosity at work. I mean, Foucault characterized monstrosity as the being outside of the law, right? If you're not subjected to the law, there's a way in which the law is not able to control one's social way of behaving in society, and he characterizes that as a kind of monstrous state of being. And in a way, the robotic is outside the law in just that Foucauldian sort of way, to ameliorate its violence, its invisible but felt effects, to naturalize the techno-human. If the robot didn't do it, it's because the algorithm did. But algorithms share code with no touch, no feeling, no thoughts of their own. It's if-then, or anybody's for that matter. Algorithmic logic is intelligible unintelligibility, or unintelligible intelligibility. You know, trading algorithms, for example, those who use them to make zillions of dollars can't tell you how they work. So there's a kind of, right, they produce intelligible outcomes. My bank account is getting fatter, but nobody can tell you exactly how the algorithm is operating, seemingly making the unintelligible plausible while plausibility unintelligible. The very heart of algorithmic rationality, where abnormality has become everyday monstrosity, it's become the commonplace. Unintelligibly and plausible deniability have become our operating system. So who's at fault, for example, when the driverless car, driven by an algorithm, or set of algorithms after all, who's at fault when the driverless car kills someone, or the shooterless gun goes on a rampage, right? I mean, there's nobody physically pulling the trigger, right? Can the robot be negligent, purposely or irresponsibly avoiding what it's supposed to do? So the techno-human, like monstrosity more generally, calls law into question, which is the very drive of digital technology. The settled law becomes unsettled, and that's exactly what's going on in the US at the moment. I mean, everything is called into question at this point. And you think of cultural productions along these lines. Ex Machina, the movie, right, is a really interesting examination of where ethical responsibility begins and ends, you could say. Both of the machinic and its past, its collapse into a kind of techno-human new. Dread is the realization of techno-futures turning our future, in the sense I'm pointing to, kind of futureless. Futureless in ways we actually recognize. So I want to sort of think for a moment about the mode of production that this gives rise to, and I'm going to call it a mode of tracking capitalism. When you think of neoliberalism, I mean, we all know what neoliberalism today refers to. It's the financialization of everything. It's deregulation. It's this, a kind of disruption that will enable rapid progress and growth, a kind of solving of new problems that keep emerging in this quickened temporality, a minimizing of the welfaring functions of the state, or what I call the caretaking state, and a maximizing of securitization. So we're seeing the resources of the state shift from looking after people to securitizing the borders, more police, more army, or more police-like armies, more weaponry, and so on and so forth. A personalizing of responsibility, proliferating endless opportunities, coming with the mandate of incessant striving to make something more of oneself. I mean, all this goes under the sign of neoliberalization, right? But there's also a dehistoricization. Accounting for the historical is no longer a concern of neoliberalization. It's presentist and forward-looking. A kind of algorithmic temporality as the mediation of time and info power, as I said earlier. And what comes out of this is the production of what, again, Foucault calls of entrepreneurialism, what Foucault calls enterprise man. Every one of us is turned into an enterprising person looking out to create for themselves conditions of possibility. I mean, that's what enterprise, after all, means, whether it's business, commerce, thinking great thoughts, flying to Mars, and so on and so forth, right? And what came out of neoliberalization is, in its more extended sense, in the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, was what I call event capitalism. Event capitalism had an interesting kind of expression. Event capitalism was a kind of capitalism of cruises, of boat cruises, right? It was the eventfulness of extended concerts, right? Of festivals, of fairs, of elongated church services in the evangelical sense of it, right? Where what was happening in all of these cases was not just buying something in the moment, but an extensive way in which buying, purchasing, consumption was built into the everyday. When I went on a cruise, I wasn't just paying upfront for the cruise, I was paying at every step of the way for what the cruise was helping me do. And even at the end of the cruise, the photographs that I could take home with me, the mementos. Similarly with concerts or with church services, buying the t-shirt and so on and so forth, right? So what event capitalism did was it elongated the consumptive experience in order to continue commodification over time. And what happens with event capitalism is the pandemic, as we've experienced it, brought it to a screeching halt. And it brought it to a screeching halt precisely because the driving modes of event capitalism were kind of ground zero for pandemic spread. I mean, where did we find out first about the rapid spread of COVID-19 was from boat cruises, where people were stuck in confined spaces and readily replicating the virus as it spread through. Similarly with concerts or big football matches and so on and so forth. You can go on concerts in a variety of ways and so on. What emerged alongside of event capitalism is what Shoshana Zuboff, in that book that everybody has paid attention to, called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, is surveillance, right? From about 2001 onwards, Google changed its operating platform, and its operating platform had really been a platform for searching. I mean, that's how it started out in the early 1990s, and it proliferated. We could search for everything and so on. And in 2001, its business model was part of the crisis of computerization that happened in 2001. It transformed its operating model into a platform for ordering, for consumptive practices, and particularly advertising. And its volume of sales went up by 4,000% from 2001 to 2004. And what Zuboff says happens is, out of that emerged what she called surveillance capitalism, a capitalism that used that platform to keep tabs on you, right? Kind of in your everyday of what it is you were doing, so it could keep sending stuff that you want back to you that you would then purchase, and its advertising revenue would go up as a consequence. But what happened really starting in about 2014, actually with the Jay-Z concert in Toronto in January 2014, was a shift from what Zuboff is calling surveillance capitalism to what I call tracking capitalism. Right? Surveillance is an old mode of keeping watch on people. It's wiretapping. It's tapping into their interactivities and so on. And I think that gave way to something else that was going on. And that something else is what I call tracking. Right? What these platforms like Google and Facebook and others were doing was tracking not so much what you were thinking, but your interactions, your networks of engagement, your relations with others, and keeping a tracking of your everyday activities, what you were ordering and so on, in order to be able to throw it back at you. So tracking capitalism upped the game in terms of massive profitability and inequality. So just to contrast tracking and surveillance, surveillance proceeds by monitoring the content of people are communicating, right? So you're talking to somebody on the phone and it taps into your phone and it keeps surveillance of you. It tries to wire it, it puts stuff in hotel rooms in order to figure out what you're saying to other people and so on and so forth. Tracking, by contrast, plots movements and networks. Surveillance reads of threat, danger, and performance from the content of communication and interaction. Tracking reads of from people's activity, their metadata, likely future behavior via prediction algorithms from relational data about movement networks, lines, rather than content of communication. The data supposedly dictate. Dread's intensification signals anticipation of the deepening erosion of this sense of self-direction, right? So where surveillance was a kind of, think of Bentham Foucault's kind of panoptical vision with the prison guard, unseen but watching everybody circled around them. How tracking works is everybody's feeding their data into a centralized tracker database, but you don't even see that it's there. It's not that there's a centralized figure, it's networked and dispersed across the system. Surveillance thus requires tracking in a sense. Tracking does not necessitate surveillance. That's why tracking emerges out of this. Tracking seeks to evade the charge of privacy violations that surveillance perennially suffers by insisting it is content neutral. Tracking updates surveillance. The virtuality renders tracking technology less viable, more anonymous, perversely less deeply intrusive, while more pervasive and stealthy than surveillance. Tracking generalizes, you could say, drone logic, right? Posing as your friendly enabler to advance your interests. I mean, yeah, every day you're on the internet, you get a message that comes at you. Accepting our cookies makes us work better for you. That's tracking. It is tracking you when you agree to have those cookies on your system software. Tracking, in fact, takes all to be experimental subjects. We're all its experimental subjects, its data source. So where there was a panopticon for Bentham and Foucault, I want to call this the technopticon, right? A kind of opticonic, looking at everything at all times with the data feed kind of going into one at all times. The technopticon is the virtualization and pervasion of the optipolitical, the all-seeing technology without an eye, an invisible visibility that not only surrounds but effectively plumbs our respective interiorities. As Larry Page says, we know you better than you know yourself, precisely because we're creating you, right, as you think you're creating yourself. From your desires to your interests, your quirks and gestures, to your rhythms and dream states. Yeah, the technopticon, in fact, knows you completely because it's investing in you, shaping and massaging your preference schemes. It knows your interiority by making it a tabula rasa on which it writes and rewrites. It's operating code. And now that operating code becomes each of our operating code. So there's a figure, I mean, I wish I had my images because I could show you the figure of Amelia, which is a digital virtual employer that is created by a computer programmer in the US. And Amelia is made to look exactly like a white, blue-eyed, blonde-haired worker in an office. I mean, that's her robotic kind of personality. That's how she looks, right? And Amelia is made to be us, or so the visual story, the usual story goes. It is in fact us who are being made more Amelia-like, right? So it's flipping, it's inverting the determinative function. Machines like us, in McEwen's novel, Machines Like Us, are us like and liking machines, right? We are being made machine-like and we're liking other machines. I mean, Ex Machina or Her being the case in point. We are desiring machines, ambiguity intended. We're both desiring machines and we're a desiring machine. Amelia is made us because we are effectively turned into her. And even calling her, I mean, you're calling a robot her, right? She already becomes sort of us. Amelia, in desiring Amelia, we're desiring ourselves. Narcissism, you could say, is the operating code of the algorithm. So I'm going to skip over a bunch of stuff here in the interest of time. Algorithmic culture then unsettles without being able to pinpoint the source of the unsettlement. The affordances provided by the algorithmic cover over the sources of the unease, in part because the sources of the benefits are also the grounds of the unsettlement or the disruption. And then what adds to this unsettlement, and I'll be very quick here, so I won't discuss it in any detail, are these two other anxiety-producing considerations on top of this unsettlement of our very mode of how we operate in the world, of our operating system, you could say. One is the pandemic, of course, right? Where the disease intensifies our dis-ease, right? being locked into ourselves, so to speak, our lockdown, our not being able to interact with others other than through an operating system like this, right, where we're virtually engaged with each other, right, where the face-to-face becomes virtualized and so on, where masking is the interface between us and others, and so on and so forth. I walked in the other day into a elevator at work with a mask on, and a young woman walked in. Actually happens to be Taiwanese, and she looked at me and I looked at her, and we each said, "Is that you?" I mean, she's a student of mine. You know, we couldn't quite recognize each other, but because of the interface of the masks between us. So the pandemic has exacerbated this condition, as has climate change. Jem Bedell has written about the way in which climate change is producing eco-anxiety, which is now registered in psychological association handbooks as an anxiety disorder. People actually go to therapists because of the ecological anxiety they're suffering, not knowing when the next disaster, the flood, the fire, the disruption of lives is going to come from. So both of these things then exacerbate the condition of algorithmic life. There's much more, of course, to be said about both, but these three things together are producing this sort of palpable sense of dread. And out of this emerges this driving condition of different ways of being in the world, right? On the one hand, you know, climate change is not produced by man, it's not man-made, it's God produced, or even if it is man-made, we have no control of it. Let's just continue to live how we've been living. And on the other side, we completely have to change our way of being in order to reduce the dramatic increase in the temperature, right? Otherwise, we're going to see 5 or 10 feet of sea level rise over the next half century. And that sea level rise is going to completely reshape the coastal lines of the entire world, right? So between those two, making a choice of living one way or living another way becomes different ways of being in the world. And those ways of being in the world are at loggerheads with each other. And that's what I mean about civil war emerging out of it. You see it palpably driven in a variety of ways, whether it's over ecology, climate change, whether it's over racial considerations in the US and so on and so forth, right? You see a way in which organizations like Génération Identitaire, the identity generation in France, which is now proliferating across Europe, a kind of right-wing youth, sort of youth organizations are pushing back against the 68 generation, as they put it in their Génération Identitaire have actually produced what they call a declaration of war, and their war is against the way of living that was produced out of May 68. And they are rising up against it in this sort of right-wing resistance to migration, to the change in the demography, in this case of the French, and so on and so forth. And the changing demography, and I'll move quite quickly over here. The changing demography, particularly in a country like the United States, but I would say globally, is actually exacerbating the condition. So what do I mean by this? We'll just take the numbers in the US and then I'll try to generalize a little bit. 20 years ago, the US was 71% white people living in it, according to the census. 10 years ago, that number was about 67%, so it had dropped nearly 5%. And today, right, the recent census, whites make up about 57% of the American population. So the prediction is, with birth rates of people of color increasing and birth rates of white people not just diminishing, but people growing older and dying, within 15 or so years, the whole of the US is going to start looking like California. There will be no majority. There will be no white majority. And so part of the anxiety and the disruption is losing control politically and in terms of defining what life could be as a result of losing majority status. And part of what you're seeing with the attack on voting rights and the attack on critical race theory is being fed by that palpable fear. And when seeing a similar condition with a different kind of outcome in a place like China, where there's the birth rate is the death rate is spiraling and the birth rate is shrinking, so they try to introduce the capacity to have more kids from younger couples and so on. But that sense of finding a way to control what is in a way out of control is a palpable condition too. If you think of the racial demography of the world, people of European descent, of white European descent, make up only something like a little over 11% of the world population. So the world is becoming dramatically more mixed, right? In a global north that is used to having white European descendant control of its environment. And it's becoming increasingly anxious with the loss of control that goes along with so-called majority rule. And so there's an attempt to produce, I mean, I grew up in South Africa, there's an attempt to produce or reproduce white minority rule through these controls of the ballot box and through the control of the telling of the story of history about itself, of how it came to be, and so on and so forth, right? I mean, I can say more about that. So for Kierkegaard, and I'll draw this to a close, for Kierkegaard, dread takes hold with the impossibility of awe, with the evaporation of all AWE, aw's ultimate source. To one side of indifference, a feeling of being overwhelmed manifest. Here, dread tends to reproduce the politics of despair, of compounding violence, or political and cultural standoffs in its wake of the kind I've been pointing to. Dread extends apartness, stresses the logic of segregation in this way in which dread plays out. I want to say there's another way too. And ultimately, as I put it, civil war. It takes as given the refusals of engagement, the projected torments, the despair and loathing directed at the non-recognizable and those presumed not to belong, all deeply predicated on trying to hold these futureless futures at bay. But on the other side of indifference, however, dread can also imply that one cares, right? So on the one side, it's like, stop this. And on this side, right, this sort of sense of dread is like, okay, yeah, it's getting me off my behind, do something, what can I do about it? That care can take hold even as a abiding sense of dread makes it difficult to get out of bed in the morning. That suggests a more complex landscape of concern. What was witnessed in the wake of, say, the George Floyd's public murder, his execution, is something akin to Marcuse's great refusal, the collective moment of enough. I've seen all I have to see. I don't want this to be anymore. I'm going to get up and do something about it. You know, whether it's taking to the streets or something like that. Of course, there are more complex interactions between these two modalities, but I just want to put them out there as the binaries that pull at each other. So there's a kind of counter politics, right? An insistence on the right to breathe, where that right to breathe is breathing clean air. That right to breathe is not being asphyxiated by the police. That right to breathe is being free to think together in new and innovative ways, and so on and so forth. And that produces a counter politics, what I call a politics around the infrastructure of care. What are those infrastructures necessary today for collective sustenance and earthly, not just sustainability, but reproducibility. De Castro, the anthropologist, Severus de Castro, talks of living without, we're going to have to figure out perhaps of how to live without cell phones once again, right? Both in that cultural sense, but also in the sense that the pieces that go, the materials that go into making cell phones are those that are ruining the environment as well. And so one can ask, what is the collective politics at work over here across these registers? The counter to dread then involves co-developing a collective ecology of caretaking, not in that old sense of a kind of welfare state, although one might pull on some of that history, but an ecology not simply reducible to the one-to-one, face-to-face. It's not just caring as affect, right? It's caretaking as infrastructure. So there's care as affect and disposition of the one-to-one, and that's not unimportant. But there's caretaking, or the infrastructure of caretaking, as collectively taking care of the possibility of life for us all. And so what are the infrastructures of caretaking? There are obviously hospitals, there's schools, there are things we can do together to enable the possibility of not just a decent life, but a dignified life for all. And that ecology of caretaking demands attending to the quality, equality, and impact of enabling social design. So it makes us think about what design amounts to. There are lots of examples I can give. The resources and infrastructures of living. Community organizing is committed to creating together the imperative social infrastructures of caretaking. And it's that caretaking, those infrastructures. What are the conditions of possibility that we create together that allow people to live? And I'll end just with this. There are infrastructures of social control. I've mentioned some of them, like tracking, policing, schooling in this old modality. And there are infrastructures of social support, of enabling the conditions for people to make dignified lives for themselves. The strivings of street protests are for an engaged being or doing or achieving in common. They are for making collective choices in the face of fear and trembling. Kierkegaard again. The practices and struggles of what Mbembe calls the in common, the making together, for reimagining and reconstructing a commons, any semblance of which has been more or less undone over the past half century. This requires resourcing or resourcing or a repairing, a putting back together, a remembering, a co-composition and a repair. I mean, Abdul Malik Simon has a new book coming out called The Surround, where he's talking about the interactive engagements of relationalities that are required for all of this. The fixes are not simply technical or technological, like an immunitarian vaccine for the pandemic projected to enable businesses before. I mean, it's precisely the business before that produced the condition we're in. So we can't go back to what we were used to, because that will continue to reproduce the very condition that has produced the dread that we're suffering at the moment. The transformations have to be socio-structural and axiological. Kind of reparation, a repairing as a repairing, and putting back together, putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. Right? A kind of revivified thinking for how to be and do together in and for the collective world that we have to make together. We have to come together to figure this out together. Of value and ways of being fashioned from living together relationally in the world, in this world, as Glissant insisted. And I'll end just by saying that relationality is the method to think through and with. I mean, Glissant's Poetics of Relationality is a very enigmatic book, but it's something I think collectively as humanists we ought to go back and grapple with, precisely because it's so rich in its suggestibility of what we might use in order to the resources. Relationality both as a mode of seeing, right, of how we see each other and see the world through the sense of relationality, but relationality also as a mode of being. So the two go together, a mode of being and a mode of seeing. And so relationality is a methodology for thinking through ways of being and thinking through ways of seeing. And I'll end just there. Thanks very much for your patience. Really appreciate it. You're muted, Sebastian. Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you very much, David, for this very rich and thought-provoking talk. And I personally have been somehow reflecting on these issues too. And I think your comments are, and as well as your book, are really a welcome kind of balm for, I think, many people, I believe. Yeah. And I was especially struck by the idea of the civil war that's being actually waged on an everyday basis. I was thinking that in those terms as well. Looking at what's happening in Taiwan, our own society. I mean, it's so obvious that people who are politically on opposite ends of the spectrum are actually waging symbolic civil wars against each other every day. So, some years ago, actually, I had a debate with a colleague about identity formation in Taiwan, and it just seems to me that we just crossed each other. We didn't seem to be really communicating, precisely because of this completely divided kind of social situation. But anyway, I think it's very important that you related that in today's talk. Specifically, I mean that's just one of the issues that you dealt with. But I think that was immensely, I think, important. That algorithmic culture that we've been completely kind of swallowed up in this algorithmic temporality, where there seems to be no exit. All temporalities have been eliminated or faced in front of this onset of algorithmic temporality, and also I was struck by the not really, but because I've read your stuff, but the importance of caretaking, and so. When I was listening to your talk, I was wondering whether or not there's some kind of let's say affinity between you and Bernard Stiegler. He's also putting so much emphasis on the kind of negative impact of algorithmic culture, and he kind of at the end of his career summed up this whole these discourses by by emphasizing the importance of care, of prendre de soin. So, I in addition to admiring your talk, I'm just interested in maybe seeing more kind of a elaboration on how, or maybe just how you would like to respond to Stiegler. Yeah. And let's maybe my very kind of crude and unreflective response to your talk would stop here, and after your maybe elaboration on this, we'll open the floor to the audience. David? Your mic is not turned on. Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Thanks. Civil War, I mean, there's been a good deal of historical work on civil wars, of course, of particular civil wars and how they elaborated and come to be the way in which, when you think about civil wars are usually thought of in relation to getting control. I mean, what's going on in Ethiopia at the moment, getting control of the resources of state to put to work on behalf of an agenda, usually to promote the wealth of those who get control of it in the name of providing for the people, right? And the people continue to suffer no matter the outcome, I mean, one way or the other, right? And I wanted to think of civil war in a more expansive conceptual mode of civil wars always being about different perceptions of what it is to live well in the world, right? And that mode of being of what it is, whether it's one group against another, you don't belong in the sociality that we're creating for ourselves. That's one way. You're a different ethnicity, Hutu and Tutsi in the 1990s in Central Africa and so forth. Civil war over slavery, and we don't like those practices, or we don't like that political economy. It's not part of who we are, and so we're going to go to war to end it. But it's also control of the mechanisms of state, right? And I wanted to think of civil war as a sense of deeply contrasting commitments to the point of being prepared to die in defense of different ways of institutionalizing a way of being in the world, right? I mean, it doesn't always play out quite so happily or quite so straightforwardly. But the question is why those contrasting ways of being in the world have taken, at certain moments in history, say, and we're in one of those moments of history, why they take on larger ramifications, why they, almost globally now tend to assume, that they play out differently in particular states according to the particular conditions in those states and those particular histories, but why it is that a certain culture pervades not just a state here or there, but more broadly, right? So why is it that autocratic rule from, early in the 2010s started taking hold across Central Europe, across increasingly in the United States, so that by 2016, it kind of manifested itself in other parts of the world as well, right? And these things come and go according to local politics, but at the same time, we're in an unsettled moment, and that unsettled moment has made more palpable as a result both of technological implication and as a result of these things on top of that, including the pandemic and ecological sets of consideration. A way in which this becomes ramified, becomes more driven, and civil war. A way, Foucault speaks of civil war as the very condition of politics itself, right? And what he means by that is a way in which all the driving social conflicts become a condition of warring, right? So it's sort of Clausewitz turned on his head, right? Civil war is not politics by other means. Politics is civil war by other means, right? In that sort of twisted sense. And so I think civil war has a way of bringing us to the driving concerns that with which we should all be really worried at the moment, because people really are prepared to kill each other over these things we've seen in certain considerations, right? And to say, wait a moment over here, what is it that you're up to? What, I'll give you a small concrete example, but it, I think, is a microcosm of the larger. In the schooling attacks, right? The attacks on school boards and reading lists and so on across the United States at the moment in the name of attacking critical race theory. The identification of certain books, Toni Morrison's Beloved or The Bluest Eye, that should be banned from high schools, or Ruby Bridges' memoir of a time as a 6-year-old in 1960, the young little black girl who's the first to integrate a New Orleans school. And she has to walk through a really aggressive group of adults and teenagers as a 6-year-old, accompanied by federal officers, right, protecting her, who are screaming and shouting and pelting eggs and so on and so forth. And, parents want to ban the teaching of her memoir now, today, 60 years later, right? Want to ban the book from being taught in schools because, according to these parents, the memoir has no white redemption in it, no redemption for whites, right? Well, there was no redemption at the time. All the white teachers but one left the school and wouldn't come back for the rest of the year, right? And they don't want, what is interesting about the banning of these books is that these parents don't want, it's not that they want to restrict the school from having their kids only read it. They want no kids to read it. So if I have a kid that I want to read that book at school, they're saying to me, you can't read it. So they're prescribing for me, right, what they refuse to consider, right, for themselves. So there's a way in which there's a kind of a microcosm of civil warring at work in, what looks like a small example, but has much larger implication, because it's exactly about the historical memory we have of the society that we inhabit. And I'm sure there are lots of examples one can give in other societies as well. The caretaking question is a really interesting one. So there's the effective condition of care, right? How we interactively, face-to-face, person-to-person care for each other. I have a neighbor, how are you doing? Are you're feeling unwell? Can I get something for you? Do I need to take you to hospital, et cetera, et cetera? There's that kind of person-to-person consideration, right? And then there's the conditions that structure the society that enable the possibility of the society to be a caring society for others, for its population at large, right? Not for some in its population, but for all of its population. So to link this to technology, there was, in bigger countries, Taiwan's a smaller country, but it might be the same in Taiwan. There are parts of the country that are, because more sparsely populated, because more difficult to get to, right, don't have internet or don't have good internet access. So caretaking would be, okay, those parts of the country also tend to have less resources available to them. So does the society act in a way, in a caretaking infrastructural way, to ensure that even though there are less resources available to them, the resources of connecting them, not to be able to track them, though that might be part of the state formation as well, right? But to be able to provide them with the infrastructural resources that the society is making available to those in urban settings more readily, right? And so Stigler is interesting. He's right, or he was right about the of needing to attend to the conditions of care. But the conditions of care are material conditions and not just affective conditions. And I want to link in that Berlantian kind of way. I wanted to draw together, you know, the way in which how one approaches affect runs together the material conditions with the affective conditions. The two can't be so readily prized apart. You can think them apart, but they need to be thought together in a way that that ends up being productive rather than debilitating.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just very quickly pursue like the, you know, what you said about the symbolic civil war.
Right.
If the kind of phenomenon of dread actually involves everybody, you know, involves both parties of the Civil War, then how would this politics of dread actually work in real everyday life situations? For instance, how are you going to reach out toward the other part, which is also, you know, engulfed in dread? How are you going to communicate?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's a great question. So I've been thinking about this. I've just been working on a book, finishing a book around the politics of critical race theories as we're experiencing it here in the US. And I've been thinking about and looking at some of the literature on virtue theory. And it's linked to what this warring condition has produced. And you've seen it really in the US in particular. I can speak to it much more readily and palpably, right? Is not just the waning of trust, but the actual destruction of trust. And I mean that across the board. Not just the trust in each other, the trust in science, right? The trust in authoritative knowledge formation. I mean, one doesn't always want to trust these sorts of things, but I want to be able to trust scientists for telling me what, how the pandemic is going to sort of unfold as best they can, given the information they have. They're much better at it than I am. I want environmental scientists to tell me what the impacts of sea level rise of 5 or 7 or 10 feet are going to be, or the temperature rise of 2 degrees over 1.5 degrees, right? Because they can model it in a certain way. Well, when you undercut trust in the very possibility of being able to spell out these sorts of things for you, you've reached a point when nothing is any longer possible. So my response is a way of, the politics of dread produces a civil warring condition. I mean, these two sides. The question that comes out of it for me is undoing dread on either side requires the rebuilding, the repairing for both sides of a conditions of possibility for beginning to trust in each other and trust in these sort of larger questions. The trust in politics, the trust in voting, the trust in science, the trust in medical science, the trust in education, the trust in, taking people seriously when they want equality in the society, and so on and so forth, right? So it's how do you think your notion of trust as the bridge between these two conceptions of dread, right? That allows, once again, a kind of meeting, I don't want to say in the center, but a meeting, a crossing that can take place where you can begin to fashion a language of possibility of engaging each other. Because I think we've lost that, actually. I mean, right in these two sides. I mean, you and I can talk, but if we bring in a Trumpian, then like, what are you talking about?
Right. So let's work on it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Now we have the floor is open, and we have a few questions here. David, can you look at the chat board?
Yeah, I see.
First question would how do you configure the sense of dread as a strategy for resistance rather than an overwhelming sense of something symptomatically wrong in the world? Yeah, I mean, can dread be the source of resistance to what you call tracking capitalism? That's the first question.
Yeah.
Also, connection
yeah,
of
so I mean, so dread is being produced out of in part at least out of tracking capitalism, right? I mean, tracking is taking place in all kinds of ways. I mean, what I didn't mention in the talk, for example, in last April, so April 2020, I mean, so shortly going after, within months of going into pandemic lockdown and so on, in the US, and I'm sure it was the same elsewhere, employer tracking of employees working from home went up 10% and kept rising, right? China introduced, I mean, even prior to the pandemic, was introducing tracking of the emotions of kids in classrooms responding to teacher. They were taking photographs every few minutes, 30 seconds or something, right, of student responses, children's responses to the teacher's teaching in order to get it, they're measuring it on a scale of 5 different kinds of responses and so on. Right, which then fed into an informational system for the teacher. How do I change my teaching in order to better reach students who are not being emotionally reached in a certain kind of way? But it's also a way of assessing the teacher, right? I mean, if you have this informational power base and so on and so forth. So dread emerges out of that condition. I'm dreading going to work because I'm, this eye is watching me all the time. I'm dreading opening my computer because it's sort of there all the time. And the politics that emerge out of that, I mean, as Sebastian and I were talking, Hal and I were talking, was exactly the politics of this bifurcation. On the one hand, I'm going to resist that. On the other hand, it's like, my life's at a loss because of it. And I'm sort of sinking into a malaise and so on. Or I'm getting angry about it and, I want my authoritarian leader because the authoritarian leader will. And so on the one hand, I mean, if you leave it at that, it's a politics of civil war, as I was arguing. One has to think of ways of undercutting the conditions of possibility of dread production on both sides in order to work one's way out of it. So putting limits on the control of the algorithmic of our lives, right? That's not to say we can't have algorithms as part of our lives, but it's, the algorithm shouldn't be controlling us. We should be controlling the algorithms if it's possible to do that. I'm being simplistic over here, but that's one way of putting it. And so the discussion we were having around trust a moment ago is trying to figure out ways of virtue creation that undercut the way in which dread is being produced, that undercut the material conditions of possibility out of which dread is emerging. So that's in part the argument about the politics of dread at work.
Okay, then we have a second question by Asia Xu. The question is there any way to resist or find cracks in the all-seeing system to escape or take leverage from it? Or is this the idea of resistance another idea implanted by neoliberalism or tracking capitalism? Kind of similar to the previous one. Eh?
Yeah, I mean, the question of resistance is an interesting one. I mean, of course, there's when anxiety kind of increases and so on, or a collective anxiety increases, how do you begin to address it? I don't want to say resistance is futile. I mean, one can always turn off one's machine. You get friends on Facebook saying, I'm going off Facebook for 6 months. And I mean, that's not a bad thing, right? Because you're not being fed this sort of condition all the time. I mean, the difficulty of it is, of course, with institutional life. I mean, we work in institutions, and, you know, in order to continue to work in institutions, everything is being run through the digital technology, which is, you know, everything. And so, you know, when the technology goes down, life stops, right? For a moment, for a day, for a period of time, and so on and so forth. When the electricity goes out, I mean, there's no, you know, what is the possibility of interaction anymore? And so I think resistance is a necessity. It's how one resists and what it is that one is resisting against, that one needs to. So as you say, finding the cracks, right? And prizing those cracks open, putting the technology to work for oneself. You know, redirecting the apparatuses in order to put them to use. The way in which digital technology is used to get on the street. I mean, right, calling a flash mob as a kind of political undertaking. Tomorrow we're going to go and protest there together or an hour from now, and, you know, 500,000 people show up or whatever. So putting it, you know, finding ways to put the technological conditions to work, and pushing back against the way in which the Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons and so on are sort of controlling our lives. You know, not being moved. I mean, building, you know, resistance has multiple factors at work. I mean, there's the, you know, the conventional political resistance where one goes out and one collectively organizes together and one protests or one moves to get laws changed and so on and so forth. There's also a kind of psychic resistance, right? And psychic resistance is also incredibly important. So how does one build, you know, both alone and together, psychic resistances against the constant feed that one is being given through the platform technologies, through the platform capitalisms that are feeding one, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or whatever. And you know, what do you like? What do you don't like? I never ever on Facebook tick a like or a dislike of something, right? Never. I mean, as a matter of principle, because as soon as I do that, you start to get a kind of feed that is predicated on that like. When you know, I also am quite self-conscious of, you know, when I usually look at progressive media and so on, of course, because that's, you know, I want to see what analyses are going on. But I'll go and look at Fox News, and I'll go and look at Fox News because I want to know what they're doing. And then I get, I mean, as part of this book I'm doing, Critical Race Theory, I did a bunch of research on the Heritage Foundation, which is this, you know, the probably the most important, or among the most important right-wing and most powerful right-wing foundations in America. I keep on getting feeds from the Heritage Foundation for consuming their publications, right, as a consequence. So it's sort of building the kind of resistance to what it is that one's getting on, you know, coming from all sides and developing. And I think this also goes to a kind of heuristic functionality within the university. How do we build, talking to colleagues, to people who work with me at my institute today, actually, how do we build mechanisms? How do we, you know, in a liberal arts environment, say, in a recreated liberal arts environment, how do we recreate a set of critical tools for critical thinking for our times in terms of parsing information, the flows of information that come at us, in terms of understanding how one questions in a critical modality, how that informational database is composed, what assumptions are built into it. So we get our students from the ground up in our university training for them. We get them to think critically and creatively about the work that informational power is doing, right, as it's coming at us, so that they're always thinking critically in relation to it. And I think, part of the resistant pushback is that heuristic undertaking that I think is increasingly important.
Okay, thank you. Question 3, can we take dread as a kind of conditioned effect because it concerns the condition of possibility of existence rather than any specific object? And that's why infrastructure condition is of great importance here. Questions from Hong Chong.
Yeah, hi Hong Chong, great to see you, even though you're invisible. So can we take dread as a kind of condition effect because it concerns a condition of possibility? Right. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how I would want to understand its basic, call it functionality, right? And that's exactly, as you say, that's exactly why the infrastructural condition is of driving significance over here, right? Precisely because it's become the driving condition effect of our time. I mean, that's the argument I'm trying to make, right? What I'm defining as dread as that condition, or trying to give a characterization of, is exactly the emergence of that, as you put it, that condition affect, but also condition effect, right? That emerges, that then shapes, I mean, insofar as anxiety is the driving palpable condition of our moment, those who control of the mechanisms of social ordering have us in their grip, right? Precisely because we're always sort of trying to move and dance in relation to this condition. And so it's just pulling the levers of the condition to be able to keep controlling through the technological mechanisms, how we move and so on. And so rebuilding the infrastructures, those infrastructures of care and what are marked as trust as well, becomes imperative as a way of repositioning in relation to those mechanisms, and finding out how, some people are doing really interesting work, critical work on facial recognition technologies and stereotyping. And that work is being undertaken precisely in a way that, speaks to the Amelia example that I gave, right? That way of thinking about it is how you turn the technology, on the one hand, against itself, against its driving power condition, but on the other hand, to put it to use in a more enabling kind of way for everybody, right? I mean, the technology is enormously powerful. The question is, what use are you putting that power to? And so, it exactly becomes a question around what I'm calling virtues or values, right?
Okay, there's another question from him.
Mm-hmm.
Information science department is the most popular and powerful in college, and kids have to learn writing algorithms since primary school. What should higher education do?
Yeah, I began speaking to that. I mean, it's an important question, Hong Chong. I began speaking to that in talking about, one of the things that we're doing, and I've just co-written with a staff worker of mine, a young staff worker. We've had a foundation grant to write an account of what we're calling the future of liberal arts education, right? And one of the arguments we're making It'll be released in a couple of months. I mean, we'll do a big public release of it. And we're quite excited about, sort of providing means and mechanisms for thinking of the way in which liberal arts education can be repositioned and refactored. Somewhat in the way we were discussing Hangzhou in Tokyo just before the pandemic broke out, right? One of the things that we were doing is sort of looking, as I briefly mentioned earlier, in response to your earlier question, is looking at the way in which we can get our students better to understand the constructivity, what goes into framing and fashioning and the work to which informational databases are put. So let me give you a couple of examples, right? There's a curriculum being developed by a colleague of ours, a young colleague actually at UC Davis, University of California, Davis, in which he takes a database like housing in states across America, and the availability of housing, the availability of affordable housing. And so she provides the students with the database, and she asks the students, how is this constructed? What is its history? Why was this database constructed to begin with? It's a national database. What use was it intended for? What work is it doing, has been put to? So you're looking at the way in which the database is constructed through the use of algorithms. I mean, algorithms are driving the way in which information is not just inputted, but also organized within it. And you're looking at the ways, critically at the ways in which that database is both constructed and the work to which it's being put. Who's being advantaged by it, who's being disadvantaged by it, what is being overlooked in the way it's being structured, and so on. So it gets the students from the moment they enter higher education to begin to think about different ways in which databases can be put to work for better or worse purposes, right? So it begins to think about the critical framing of databasing. And that would be one way. I mean, there are other ways you can think about this. The other, facial recognition technology would be another, again, driven by algorithms. What are the assumptions or presumptions going into the construction of algorithms for recognizing faces? On one hand, blacks and women are less recognized by facial recognition algorithms, in part because of cosmetics, in part because of skin color, but in good part because of the way the algorithms are written and the biases that are imprinted within them. And one of the arguments is to have better databases on which to on which to apply the algorithms so that they recognize a wider range of people. So that's one purpose. Another purpose is, do you actually want to be recognized by these facial recognition algorithms, right? So it raises the very question about what work they're being put to and why, and to whose ends, and for whose benefits, and who's disbenefiting from this. If facial recognition algorithms are being used to police people, then maybe you actually want to stop them being used at all, at least for those purposes. Right?
Well, thank you very much, David. I guess those were all the questions. Before any other questions come in, let me just ask you something else, which is kind of related to the first and second questions. In both Freud, especially Lacan's psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic theories, this uncanniness, or in Lacan, in Lacan, object petita. The beginning of uncanniness is, it happens, once in a, every once in a while in our life, daily life, it happens again and again, but it can serve as actually as a kind of prelude to seeing the crack in the system. If, according to Lacan, if we can understand the object petita, or the uncanny object, as our symptom, the symptom of the malfunctioning of the big system. So I guess maybe we are now in a situation where this uncanniness become like prolonged. It's like it's not happening intermittently, but it has become a characteristic that just attaches itself to our everyday life. So it has kind of lost its function of being an actual object petita, uncanny object. It's like life itself has become uncanny, and therefore we're not able to see what the uncanny could lead us to see.
Yeah,
so
that's a really.
Not,
yeah, sorry, I finished.
Go ahead. I was wondering whether
it's a really interesting way of putting it, right? There are these moments, and we do appear to be in one of them, precisely because we don't have a palpable sense of all the conditions that are pervading our lives, right? I mean, the uncanniness and the pervasiveness of the uncanniness, the generalizability of the uncanniness, is a function of the invisibility of the driving forces, right? That are obviously also technological, but because they're unseen and indeed inexplicable. I mean, even the people who are most benefiting from them cannot explain, cannot give a full explanation of what it is, of how these forces are operating, right? So there's a sense in which, I mean, as you say, the pointed uncanniness has become the whole thing. And so maybe we need to look for the mundane and the banal as the point of the crack, right? I mean,
interesting.
To turn it on its head, so that it's like, okay, why is it that the discomfort is being driven by everything we're doing, except for the banality in which we find a kind of reassurance about being with ourselves, or being not driven by all these things, being outside the dome of control momentarily, and so on. And maybe that is a hint exactly of what it is that we need to do in order to unplug, or bring the house down in a certain sort of way, and so on and so forth. What is it when that, I mean, on the one hand, in the Lacanian sense, the uncanny is the point of enough, right? I'm done, and I'm seeing that there's a crack that I can open up and get through, right? And we can get to another place. When the uncanny becomes absolutely generalized, right? Is it that there are absolutely no cracks at all, or we're just not seeing them? And the not seeing them is a function of the fact that we're so fully infused in the bubble, right? That we can't even see that there's a possibility of a way out, when in fact it's right in front of one, right? And the question is how we shift our disposition, how we shift our look to recognize exactly what's right in front of our eyes, right? Is it just that we have to pull the plug out of the wall? So, is it just that we turn off the computer for a day, a month, a year? Is it just that we take a walk on the beach, right? and so on and so forth? Is it just that we don't go to large concerts, but actually hang out with the person closest to us and have a real conversation, right? Not shouting at each other. I mean, I'm just throwing this out as you know, what are the banalities that place in question, right, what we're told is the no way out? I mean, is there really no exit in the Sartrean sense? Or is it that we're just like driving by it all the time because we're going too fast?
I love what you said about, the kind of a reversing of the status of the banality or mundanity.
Right.
I think what you're saying is very maybe Deleuzian, the regaining the belief in the world, or even Taoist, and that's what Taoist actually asks us to do.
And those histories are crucially important, right? I mean, to recuperate them as a way of saying, hey, there's another way of being here.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's right in front of you, but you don't see it because you have been inundated with all these algorithmic culture,
right,
which leads on you to the path of this generalized dread.
right.
On the one hand, you seem to be trying to catch up with everybody, but on the other hand, you feel that nothing is enough,
right?
And that and there's a huge kind of a uncharted territory there, which is going to swallow you up. So that's the dread. But, then if you stop, if you unplug, then you see that real life is just in front of you, right? Walk on the beach, a chat with a close friend, and all that.
Right. Yeah, and it's it's both the lack of the capacity to recognize the right. I mean, so there's the sense of recognition, of slowing down.
Yeah.
But also the recognition that all of this has been created for us.
Exactly.
Right? And the self-creation has been denuded from us in this, right, in this imposed creation.
Yes,
and asking ourselves, what will it take for me to recreate for myself and for those with whom I'm in relation?
Exactly, yeah.
For us to create together, right?
Right. I call it a matrix moment.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, there is something, what would be the word? Matrixing about it, right?
Right.
I mean, there's a trickster kind of element within the matrix, right? And sort of,
exactly. Yeah.
Sort of finding that kind of trickster twist that allows one to turn it.
Right.
Well,
thank you, David.
I'll end just by saying I think it's imperative to hold on to this as a way of facing down that sense of doom, right? I don't want to give in to the sense that we're all doomed to this condition. Right?
And there's a real life in front of us.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, David, for this really, really enlightening talk, and we hope to connect with you very soon.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thank